Great. Well, we'll go ahead and start now. So I was going to say, just to start with, my name's Ratnavua. Really pleased to have all of you here today and really pleased to have Parami joining us. This is the fourth in a series of 6 talks from college members that we're going to have over the course of this year. So we've already had 3. So Naga Ketu spoke to us initially, the kind of the launch of the series on Triratna Day, and he spoke on Dana, and then Vajratara spoke on Sila, and Yana Vacha spoke to us recently on Kashanti. And basically what we decided was this theme of the Bodhisattva ideal and the perfections in particular, but the Bodhisattva ideal came about when we were just talking about, well, in the world today, there's so much going on and there's so many things to be concerned about. And there's so much that's kind of, in a way, distressing in the world that you could wonder sometimes, does it make any difference if I'm practicing spiritually, if I'm following the Buddhist path and I'm active in my center and I'm meditating and I'm changing my mind and cultivating metta? Does it make a difference, or should I instead do something a bit more active out there in the world? And of course, that tension between spiritual practice and responding to the suffering of the world is the tension that causes, or is a tension from which the bodhicitta can arise. So we wanted to explore the different ways in which we can practice in the world to create that arising of the bodhicitta, which is really the only thing that'll appease or quench the suffering of the world. So that's the topic we're on tonight. And I do invite you to listen to previous talks that were given. They are recorded, and this one will be recorded too if you want to come back and listen to it again. So the outline of the event is that after this, brief introduction, I'll just speak for a few more minutes. I'll pass it over to Parami, and then she'll be talking to us on Virya today. And then after that, there'll be a short tea break. And then we'll all come back and there'll be an opportunity for questions. So the way we're going to work the questions is that at any time during the event, if you've got a question, just put it into the chat and we'll collate those. And then we'll just myself and Parami will speak to them after the tea break. So I do invite you to put questions in whenever you want. Just put them in the general chat. If you do have questions too about ordination training process in general, you're free to ask those also. Just Parami is a college member, and she's very, very active in the Spanish-speaking ordination training process. So she's a good person to have here if you've got questions like that. And then I guess, I just wanted to introduce Parami briefly before I pass over to her. So she is the current chair of the Glasgow Buddhist Center, her latest incarnation, which I think probably came as a surprise, as much as a surprise for her as anyone else. But she's a very, very long-standing private and public preceptor. She's ordained over 200 people. She's also been an international order convener for many years. That's how I first met her, was when she was traveling around the world. And she's been very, very involved with the Spanish-speaking ordination training process and the Spanish-speaking world in general. So she's lived in Spain for a while. She's been involved in Mexico. She's visited Venezuela, speaks fluent Spanish. And I wanted to say something a bit more personal about Parami. I'm really pleased she's here because I know the Bodhisattva ideal has been very dear to your heart for many years, and you've spoken to me about it. But also, I think that I've really enjoyed having ethical discussions with Parami over the years. And the reason why I've enjoyed it is that I found her to be extremely clear, extremely committed to usually an ethical life much more serious than mine, if I am going to confess. And but whenever I spoke to her, I never left feeling bad. I always left feeling that I wanted to be better. And I think that was a unique quality of listening to Parami, was that she was inspiring. And I think many people, when they listen to Parami speak and watch Parami practice and talk to her about her practice, you leave challenged by her example. Either way, I hope I'm not setting you up, but I do admire you. All right, so let me see. Just in case anyone's joined us that doesn't know, there's a translation room. There is. You can just hit the button along the lower bottom, translations in Spanish. That's the only language we're translating today. And I'm going to pass it over to Parami. Look forward to hearing what you have to say today on Virya.
Thank you, Ratnavya. Yeah, I was thinking, so we have had some interesting conversations over the years, haven't we? In all sorts of different parts of the world as well. Okay, so I'm going to open this talk on Virya by reading a poem of Sangharakshita's, and I'm going to share an image on the screen that's related to the poem. Except it's disappeared. Oh, that's a bit of a worry. Sorry about that. It was there before. I just need to find where it's gone. Oh, dash. That's very strange. Oh, I know what's happened. Okay, so back to the meeting. I'll try again. There we go. There you go. So I'm sharing, whoops. Have you got the wind horse? People, are you seeing a screen share of the wind horse?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Good. So that's the image that I want you to have in your mind as I read this poem of Sangharakshita's, which is a poem that speaks to me very much about Virya. I am the wind horse. I am king of space, master of infinity, traversing the universe with flashing, fiery hooves. On my strong back, on a saddle blazing with gems, I bear through the world the 3 flaming jewels. Once, long ago, my galloping hooves were upheld by the delicate hands of gods as I bore through the night from home into homelessness, a young prince of the Shakya clan. I am the wind horse, white like a shooting star. I appear in the midst of the darkness of the world. Sometimes I trot, sometimes gallop, sometimes stand stock still in the midst of the heavens, so that all can see me in my glory. My loud neighings as I paw the clouds echo and re-echo throughout the universe, waking those who sleep, putting to flight the hosts of indolence, apathy, and despair. Hearing the sound of my voice, heroes regain their courage. I am the wind horse. I am thought at its clearest, emotion at its noblest, energy at its most abundant. I am reverence. I am friendliness. I am joy. Only I amongst beasts am pure enough, strong enough, swift enough to bear on my back the 3 flaming jewels. With what joy I sweep through the air, bearing age after age, my thrice precious burden. With what joy, with what ecstasy, I fulfill the greatest of all destinies. Plunging, soaring, I leave behind me a rainbow track. So I wanted to share that because, as I say, that poem speaks to me very strongly of Virya. I'm going to unpack some lines, not the whole poem, but some lines of the poem as a way of moving into this, this topic. I am thought at its clearest, emotion at its noblest, energy at its most abundant. So we have in that the three faculties that we bring to our spiritual practice. We have thought, emotion, and energy. In other words, the cognitive faculty, the feeling faculty or emotional, and volition. And volition is virya. Virya is volition. Energy at its most abundant. So virya is usually translated as energy in pursuit of the good. And again, I think that image of a wind horse kind of going across the sky gives a sense of that energy at its most abundant. And in pursuit. This on the web. And in pursuit of the good. Sorry, my watch just decided to join the talk there. So in fact, I think I might take it off because it has a very bad habit of joining in. So yeah, so virya is described as energy in pursuit of the good. And thinking of the overall topic of these talks, I think we can say it's energy in pursuit of the good for the world. So not only for one's own sort of sense of good, but for the world. In his book, Mind and Harmony, Subhuti describes virya as ardor, which is a translation that I really like. And I'll read a little bit of his description of virya. He says, ardor begins to appear when longing faith is strong enough to produce effective spiritual practice. The strength of ardor therefore depends upon the strength of the faith. However, ardor isn't just a question of having very strong feelings of faith. It's also the kind of mature self-governance that can nurture and channel faith effectively and steer clear of the conditions that dissipate it. The natural activity of ardor is to turn the mind towards wholesome states. And later on, he describes it as the mental force that seeks out the skillful or the more skillful and abandons the unskillful or the less skillful. So it's energy being used well, being used in pursuit of the good, being used towards our spiritual path. It's energy that's focused, it's clean, and it's clear. So we're looking at virya and the other qualities or virtues as paramitas, but also virya is found in the list of the 5 spiritual faculties. And I'm just going to read a little bit about this because this is something that I feel for my own practice I needed to learn. Because I think most people that know me would recognise that I have not really suffered from a lack of energy, generally speaking, in my spiritual quest. What I have lacked, or certainly when I first came along and got involved, was a focused energy. It was quite dissipated. So I found this quote many years ago. It's from a book by Edward Conza, and I can't actually remember which one it is, but I've had this as one of my guiding forces for the whole time that I've been practicing. So Conza says, all 5 virtues must be regarded as one. Their balance and harmony is almost as important as the virtues themselves. One must sometimes be used to correct the excess of the other. In this way, concentration must come to the rescue of the latent faults of vigour. It's a great sentence. Concentration must come to the rescue of the latent faults of vigour. When vigour or energy have it all their own way, tranquility is in danger. We all know people with a large dash of adrenaline in their blood. I think he wrote this for me. I think he must have known me somehow when he wrote this, who are always busy, maybe even madly efficient, but not particularly restful to be with. Vigour by itself leads to excitement and must be controlled or balanced by the development of concentrated calm. So I think that's actually quite useful, because it's easy to think of energy and to kind of get a sense that it means being out there and doing things and rushing around and having lots of fizzy kind of energy. And actually, when we read this or we hear this, what it's saying is that for our energy to be truly Virya, then it needs to be focused, and there needs to be a basis of tranquility so that that energy is actually used well. However, as I said, we're looking at the paramitas, the establishment aspect of the bodhicitta. So I'm sure this is very familiar material, but just to kind of give the context, we can remember that the relative bodhicitta, the bodhicitta that we went to practice, that we went to put our lives in the service of, so to speak, has two aspects. It has the aspect of a vow, aspiration, and it has the aspect of establishment. So the vow of the aspiration is that sense that what else is there to do in this world, with this life, with this human life? What else is there to do except dedicate it to the good of all beings? So the aspiration of the vow rises from that deeply held value. And then that needs to be put into practice. So the establishment aspect, in a way, has two parts to it. Well, it's partly the manifestation of that vow in the world, but it's also the establishment in the sense that it makes that vow firmer. So they feed into each other. So the paramitas, or the perfections as they're sometimes translated, are the ways in which a would-be aspiring bodhisattva will practice so that their vow or aspiration is actually manifest and not just an idea. So as we know, we've already had talks on dana, shila, and kshanti. So generosity, ethics, and patience. And tonight we move into Virya. And patience and energy, kshanti and Virya, are often seen as a pair. They kind of support and feed each other. And I'll say a bit more about that later on. So thinking of them as paramitas, the main text, there's many texts that look at the paramitas, but the one that I'm personally most familiar with, and I've just come away from Taraloka, having been in a 1-week retreat looking at the paramitas, is the text of the Bodhicharyavatara. The Bodhicharyavatara, the guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, by Shantideva. So I'm just going to read from the first 2 verses of the chapter on the development of Virya. And I think that this is the Stephen Batchelor translation. So if you're familiar with the Bodhicharyavatara, you might know it in a different translation. Having patience, I should develop enthusiasm. For awakening will dwell only in those who exert themselves. Just as there is no movement without wind, merit does not occur without enthusiasm. What is Virya? It is finding joy in what is wholesome. It's finding joy in what is wholesome. So Virya needs to be coming from skillful mental states, giving rise to skillful activity. So I remember Bhante saying once, if you had no energy, you would be dead. So it's a case of having energy that's put in. So i.e., in other words, all of us have energy. We've all got energy at our disposal. For all sorts of reasons, people sometimes feel, I don't have the energy to have Virya, perhaps because of health reasons, perhaps all sorts of reasons that might mean that they don't feel they've got the capacity to have the energy for Virya. But I think it's quite important to think that that isn't necessarily the case, that Virya is not to do with physical energy or physical activity. It's much more to do with being willing to have mental states and any activity that moves us more and more towards the good in the world. So even if you're somebody that has some kind of illness that means that your energy is very, very limited and that you have to be very careful, that does not mean you can't have Virya. I can think of quite a few people. I mean, I don't think she'd mind me saying, but I think Vidya Mala is the most extraordinary example of Virya for those of you who know her. She's got incredibly bad health. Damadina's another person who doesn't have great health physically, but my goodness, does she have vigor in her practice. So I don't think it's the same thing. So if I'm saying this, just in case MD's listening that thinks, oh, I don't have energy. You do have energy. It's a case of what we do with it. So energy needs to be sustainable, and that's why it's also paired with patience, with kshanti. Because without virya, our patience or kshanti becomes very passive, but without kshanti or patience, virya can just become quite dissipated. So if there's no life without energy, there's no spiritual life without virya, and it needs to be well channeled. And one point to make is that it's not always loud. I think it's in the Konza quote, he says something about sometimes people aren't very restful. So in a way, Virya is restful, which is quite interesting. It's got a sense of tranquility to it as well. So going back to Bante's poem, he says, white like a shooting star, I appear in the midst of the darkness of the world. So Virya can bring light into the darkness, and that's a really important quality. But he also says, sometimes I trot, sometimes I gallop, sometimes stand stock still in the midst of the heavens. So Virya can be very, very quiet. Virya can be standing stock still. So part of that, I think, is knowing what's appropriate, knowing what to put our energy into, knowing what priorities to give time and energy to, and knowing when to pause and when to take rest, when to take stock. Going back to Shantideva in the Bodhicharyavatara, in verse 31 of that chapter, he says, the supports when working for the sake of living beings are aspiration, steadfastness, joy, and rest. So aspiration, steadfastness, joy, and rest. It's a really lovely quartet of qualities, really. So aspiration, to just try and keep our inspiration alive, try to keep our motivation alive. Steadfastness, that fact that our energy, our virya can just help us to keep going because we know how to pace ourselves. And that's spiritually pace ourselves as well as physically pace ourselves. Knowing when it's important to maybe step back for a bit, know when meditation's important, know when specific types of activity are important. And joy and rest. I mean, that's just delightful. And I'll say a bit more about that. So sometimes when we think of qualities within Buddhism, we might think of what we call near enemies to that quality. So near enemies are qualities or ways of being that can masquerade as the real thing, but actually is not quite the real thing. And the two that come to my mind for this is intoxication and enthusiasm. And it's interesting, Stephen Batchelor uses enthusiasm as his translation of Virya. And actually, I think it's easily misunderstood. So I want to just say a little bit about those two, because I think they're quite important. So enthusiasm, I think it's very easy to get enthused about things, but it's not necessarily the same as being inspired. And I think inspiration can keep your energy flowing, keep it alive, but enthusiasm can be bust and boom. We can get very enthusiastic about things, but if it isn't fed by that inner spring of inspiration and even tranquility, it's very easy for it to get dissipated. We probably all know that. We've probably all at times felt really enthusiastic about something, like, I am really going to do this thing, whatever it is. And then we forget, or something else comes along that we get equally enthusiastic about. Or perhaps I'm speaking only for myself here, but certainly I know that kind of pattern of getting very enthusiastic. I mean, I can get enthusiastic about almost anything if I've given enough time. But some doesn't necessarily mean that they're the kind of thing that's going to bring me Virya, or that's going to actually move me along the path spiritually. So I'm not knocking enthusiasm. It's great. And it's lovely to have people who are enthusiastic. And it's much nicer than people being cynical and bored. However, I think when we do feel that enthusiasm, it's very important to make sure that we feed it appropriately so that it doesn't just fizzle out and it actually turns to inspiration. I'm sure perhaps intoxication needs very little said about it, but again, I think speaking as somebody who probably had a surplus of energy when I first came along to start to meditate, I found it very easy to get intoxicated with all sorts of things. Like, I don't know, I certainly could get intoxicated about my communication with people. And being in retreat, I remember I was leading a retreat years ago when I was living at Taraloka, and I was sleeping in the community rather than in the retreat centre. And I came over about halfway through the retreat and bumped into a couple of people in the kitchen. And I was talking, even though it was supposed to be silent, but I was chatting. And one of the people said to me, "Oh God, I forgot what you're like when you've been in retreat for a while. I think you should go to bed." And it was because my energy had kind of really come up, but it was really fizzy and really kind of quite high pitched. So I've really had to work at that balance and energy so that it is really Virya rather than just energy being intoxicated. So you could think of them as the kind of near enemies. They're states of mind that we can be in and think it's Virya, but we have to be a little bit careful because they won't last. They won't have that sustaining power. They won't have that kshanti within them. And then far enemies, in terms of thinking about the states that are completely opposite or obstacles to Virya. From Bante's poem we hear, "My loud neighings as I paw the clouds echo and re-echo throughout the universe, waking those who sleep, putting to flight the hosts of indolence, apathy, and despair." So Bante's talking there about what I would consider the obstacles to Virya: sleep, indolence, apathy, and despair. And these are exactly the same list that you find in the Bodhicharya Avatara, or pretty well the same list. Where Shantideva says, this is verses 2 and 3 of that chapter, "The opposing factors are explained as laziness, attraction to what is bad, and despising oneself out of despondency. Because of attachment to the pleasurable state of idleness, because of craving for sleep, and because of having no disillusion with the misery of cyclic existence, laziness grows very strong." So just very quickly unpacking some of them. Attraction to what is bad. That reminds me of something I quite often quote from Star Wars. I can't remember which of the Star Wars films it comes from, but there is one where one of the Jedi Knights says to Yoda, I think, he says, "Why are the powers of darkness so much stronger than the powers of light. And Yoda says they're not. They're easier, faster, and more seductive, which is such a good quote. And I think that attraction to what is bad is around that, how seductive it is to just settle in, to become complacent, to stop developing virya. And despising oneself out of despondency is a really interesting one as well. You know, I think sometimes we can believe that the Dharma really works, but not for me. And that can lead to a certain level of despondency. And Shantideva says in the Bodhicharyavatara, what is so special about you? Why do you think you can't develop? What makes you so special? I think that's great. You know, why are you so special? Why am I so special that it's impossible to become enlightened when everything else and everybody else can? But I was thinking, given the koan nature of these talks, the fact that we're wondering, how do we work within the world with these qualities, these paramitas? I was thinking we can despise ourselves sometimes out of a despondency of thinking, what can I do? Like Ratnavira mentioned that in his introduction. It's very easy to think the problems of the world are so big, so huge, so demanding, that there is nothing that I on my own can do. And that can lead, I think, to despondency. So in a way, if we can develop virya, if we can develop Kshanti and virya together, I think it allows us to come out of that despondency and to think, well, even small and little actions that I can do are a way of moving out of that sense of despondency. I also like the fact that it says, having no disillusion with the misery of cyclic existence, laziness grows very strong. It's like we can get to a point where we're not quite disillusioned enough. So we're disillusioned enough with the world to get cynical, to get angry, maybe to kind of get despairing, but we're not quite disillusioned enough with samsara to want to find the conditions to move out of that. So I sometimes see people, and this is something that probably we've all seen and maybe even experienced ourselves, that often people come to Buddhism through suffering. Not always, but quite often we come along looking for something because we're in a space where we're suffering for some reason. It could be all sorts of different reasons, physical reasons, maybe we've had a major loss, maybe we've had mental health problems, anguish of all sorts, grief, all sorts of things drive us into looking for something, and we find Buddhism. And sometimes it's like, actually, we get better and then we forget what drove us into it. And we forget, we start to feel that things are much better, things are moving on. And then in a way, well, you know, I can meditate a bit and it'll keep me kind of going. But we almost lose that edge that we had when we were right up against some level of suffering. So I think when we can settle into the good conditions that we create. And I think one of the qualities of virya is it reminds us that however good things are in our lives, samsara will never fulfill us in an existential sense. It really won't. If we think we're going to find lasting, true happiness and its causes in samsara, we will just again and again and again and again find ourselves going round and round and round in a wheel of suffering. So Virya reminds us that our ultimate existential needs will never be met in a life that's based on in samsara. So Virya allows us to remember to remember. It allows us to notice when we're forgetting and start to remember again. So before moving on to a little bit more about laziness, I just wanted to say a little bit about things that can drain our energy, drain our Virya. Bhante gives a list of this somewhere. I think it might be in his talk on the Sevenfold Puja, where he gives a list of the things that drain away our energy. So this list is grumbling, carping criticism. So carping criticism, sorry, K Madama, translating this, but carping criticism isn't just a genuine seeing something that's not quite right and giving critical feedback. It's more like a if you can translate that. So it's that kind of criticism where nothing is ever right. Nothing will ever go wrong, right for you. Whatever happens, it's not quite good enough. And that kind of thing really, really drains our energy. So that's, yeah. And then cynicism can drain our energy. Gossip, he suggests, can drain our energy. And he also suggests that nagging can drain our energy. So I think that's both nagging and being nagged. I don't think either are particularly good for Virya. So yeah, so finding ways to kind of, when we find ourselves in any of those states, to really catch them and to keep our Virya alive. And one thing that I think we can do is we can help each other. I think we can find ways to help each other to keep our Virya alive. For example, I was thinking, rather than carping criticism, we could really try and develop rejoicing and enthusing and encouraging each other, because I think they're ways to keep energy flowing. So I think if we see somebody do something that's really good, that's really touched us, that's really moved us, let them know. As I remember seeing an advert on a bus in Glasgow that said, if we've done something good, tell your friends. If we've done something wrong, tell us. Which I thought was quite good, actually. So in the same sort of way, if your friends, if people that we're around, if you think they're doing good, tell everybody, including them. And if you think there's something that's maybe not so good, just go directly to them rather than telling everybody else. That's a little bit by the by, but I think it is a way of keeping our Virya clear, keeping our energy moving. So back to the poem. I am thought at its clearest, emotion at its noblest, and energy at its most abundant. So these three faculties coming together, although energy at its most abundant is most obviously Virya, I think we need all of those things for Virya to be whole and to be wholesome. Cognitive in its own is not enough. Emotion in its own is not enough. But all of them together, volition born from the marriage of cognitive and feeling faculties, will be Virya, a completely integrated moving forward of our beliefs, our feelings, and putting our energy behind that. And of course, the bodhicitta, as mentioned, is the volition. It's the will towards enlightenment. It's a volition. So Virya at its best, at its strongest, that wind horse carrying the three jewels is also carrying the Chintamani jewel, carrying the jewel of the bodhicitta, carrying that jewel, that wish-fulfilling gem, the wish being that all beings may be alleviated from suffering. And in a way, I think that's where we come to the koan of the title. The fact that we're talking about these faculties, these spiritual faculties, as something to practice within a suffering world. So before I look at that more, I want to just share with you some more about laziness. And this time it comes from a work by Gampopa, who's a Tibetan teacher. And I can't remember which century he was in. Cass Jyoti probably knows because she knows these sort of things. Anyway, he wrote his main work, the work that he's best known for, was The Jewel Ornament of Liberation. And in that, he talks, amongst other things, about the paramitas. And in the chapter on Virya, he says, there are 3 varieties of laziness: lassitude, idleness, and gross laziness. So lassitude he describes as addiction to the pleasures of mental inertia, such as sleepiness, dreaminess. So a kind of sense of it just wanting to sink into oblivion, a kind of sense of being pulled down from clarity to unclarity. And, you know, I think probably, again, we all know that state where sometimes you are just a bit fed up and kind of don't really have the energy for things, and you kind of find a way, you find yourself sort of slipping into a kind of sleepiness. And I always remember, I remember when many years ago in a community I was living in, we were going to do a puja. And I was like, oh, sorry, there's no way I can do a puja. I'm really, really tired. I think I just have to go to bed immediately, even though it's only 9 o'clock at night, and I never go to bed at 9 o'clock at night. But I'm so tired, I cannot do a puja. I'll fall asleep. And then somebody came in and said, I'm going to the cinema. And suddenly I found myself wide awake and ready to get out and go to the cinema. So, yeah. So that kind of laziness where we kind of slip into mental inertia. And then idleness is faint-heartedness from thinking. How can dejected people like myself ever attain enlightenment? We must take heart and give up idleness. So it's very similar to Shantideva's thing about despondency. There's a kind of spiritual arrogance in thinking I'm not good enough to practice. And then the last one, which is the kind of interesting one, is gross laziness is addiction to evil and unwholesome practices such as subduing enemies and hoarding money. And that's sometimes seen as politics and business. So that's quite interesting, because he's basically saying we can run around all we like, but if we're using all that energy to make more money and to engage in worldly attitudes and worldly practices, then we're not actually practicing Virya. So I guess the question that comes from that is, do we close ourselves away from the world? Do we actually develop Virya by finding ways of not being engaged with those worldly pleasures? Well, I think no. I think Virya will take us into acting in the world. So I'm going to read, I'm aware that I'm going a bit over time. I hope you'll be patient with me and have Kshanti as well as Virya. I don't have too much more, but a little bit. So a talk that Sangharakshita gave in 1976 called Evolution or Extinction, a Buddhist view of current world problems, which if you've never heard it, I highly recommend. And he says in that, he talks about all sorts of current world problems, poverty. He talks about the environmental crisis. So although it was 1976, there's already some level of awareness of that. Poverty, war, etc. And he says, so often we just try to forget. We say, well, too bad. I'm very sorry about it all, but there's nothing I can do. So why worry? So we close the newspaper, we switch off the television, and we try to just get on with our own personal lives. We try to forget current world problems, the problems of the world, of other people. And with a greater or lesser degree of hedonism, perhaps, we try to get on with our own personal lives. And then he goes on to say, now, in my opinion, thinking about this sort of attitude is just retreating from the problems, retreating in a rather narrow sense. It's really an attitude not worthy of a human being, of one who's trying to be a human being in the full sense of the word. And he goes on to say, when we when we consider current world problems, it's clear we have before us only two alternatives. On the one hand is what we call evolution, spiritual development, becoming more of an individual. On the other hand, the alternative is extinction. It really means that we, the human race, individual members of the human race, must develop spiritually, or sooner or later, just perish. So it's quite strong. And he's saying, in a way, the only alternative to allowing the world, as it were, to perish through all those particular issues is to try and actually raise consciousness. You could say it's to develop Virya. And he suggests 4 things, which I'm going to leave you with as a way of working with those problems. What can we do, he says? First of all, individual development. Because otherwise, to paraphrase, if we don't become part of the solution, we will be part of the problem. So find a method of personal development. And then he says, form or join a community with others who share your values, because we can't do it on our own. Thirdly, he says, withdraw energy from the forces that work against your values. So withdraw. So the things that we feel are draining us, and we're not able to actually be our best within them, withdraw. And then he says, if you cannot withdraw, influence. So I think there are 4 things that we can take into account, and we can apply our Virya to them. We can apply Virya energy to finding a way to develop personally, to become more skillful, to act in ways that create good in the world, and not to react in ways that cause suffering. And then find other people who will support us in that. And the withdrawal and influence are really interesting. I think they're quite radical. And I'll just leave you to think what that might mean, because for each of us, that will be different. And I think also part of that is to go beyond polarization. And I think that's what the Bodhisattva ideal offers us. I think that's where Virya can really help us to be clear about how to enter into the world, look the problems right directly, and not polarize with people who perhaps feel differently. I think that's a great big ask. I think that's very, it's not easy. And Shantideva, again in the Bodhicharya Avatara, says this beautifully. He says, virtue is perpetually feeble, and the power of vice is great and extremely dreadful. If there were no spirit of perfect awakening, what other virtue would overcome this? So that virtue is the Bodhisattva's virtue, the bodhicitta. It's the virtue of Virya amongst the other paramitas, applied to how do we deal creatively with the issues of the world. And that spirit of perfect awakening is the only thing that we can put ourselves to. Without overcoming the dichotomy of polarizing with others who we feel are different from us, the over-identification of me and mine at the expense of them and theirs, if we can not overcome that dichotomy and that polarization, we'll never find internal peace, and we'll never be able to offer peace to the world. So there you go. I think I'm going to give you some questions that you can take away and think about in your life, which is how can we deal with current world issues without buying into current world views? There's a question for you. How can we be sure we're coming from a truly dharmic perspective? So I'm not going to answer these. These are for people to think about for themselves. Can you see any dangers for your practice in engaging with contemporary issues? And lastly, what do you think we as Buddhists can offer the suffering world? So I will answer that one in the sense that I think what we can offer are values, ethics, the precepts, and the qualities of the paramitas. And I also think what we could offer is friendliness and joy. And that's how Bhante ends his poem, The Wind Horse. He says, I am reverence, I am friendliness, I am joy. So if we can offer to each other and beyond reverence in the sense of respect, love, metta, friendliness and just how we are with others, whether they're people we love or people we disagree with or people that we really don't care about, if we can offer all of them true and genuine friendliness, then we will be a source of joy in the world. And Bhante ends saying, with what joy I sweep through the air, bearing age after age my thrice precious burden. So may the joys of practice be yours. May we find a way to give joy to the world. And where the bodhicitta has not yet arisen, may it arise. Where it has arisen, may it flourish. And where it flourishes, may it never die. Thank you.
Thank you,
45
Parami.
minutes. Wasn't too bad. 45 minutes.
You did
Thank you
great.
very much. Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, no, I think I'm really pleased that you didn't stop too soon, because that was fabulous. And there's so much in that that we'll come back to too. So what we'll do now, so thanks for that first. But what we'll do is we'll take just a short tea break. So if people can, 5-10 minutes, take a tea break, a comfort break, as it's sometimes said, and then we'll come back. If you want to ask a question about the talk, we invite you to put it into the chat. And Parmi, you had some excellent questions for reflection for people. I was wondering, is it possible to get those into the chat in some way? Yeah?
Yeah, I'll type them in just now.
Okay, great. I took some notes on them, but I didn't get them all in there. So, all right. So we've got a bit of a break. So do please come back. Parmi will be answering your questions and talking a bit more informally around what she's just said. So I look forward to that. So we'll see you in a couple minutes. So yeah, the other thing I forgot to do was just to mention that if you would like to make a donation to Dhammachakra, well, actually, all donations that we received today are going to support the India Dharma Trust, which is the fund that supports ordination training in India. So that's, if you choose to donate today, it'll go to that. And also some of the funds goes to Dhammachakra, which is, of course, the platform that hosts all this and where all these things are held. And a big thank you to Zach, who's doing our tech work today. Dhammachakra's team works very hard and does great work for the movement. So happy to support them also. All right, Parmi. Well, we've got some questions. We've got quite a lot of questions, actually, more than we would be able to answer. So you've got your clap hand. Okay.
It was for Zach. That was for Zach, and it was sent her online.
Can you do the fireworks for him? There we go. All right. Well, we should dig into the questions because there's a lot of them and they're very, very good. So apologies to people if we don't get around to their question. I thought one of the questions that's come through that I thought was really, really interesting was the statement you made about not being disillusioned enough with samsara. Can you say a little more about that?
Yeah, it's a thing. I'm sure Bhante's made that point a number of times, and it's something that I've thought about quite a lot. I mean, I'm not sure I can say more than I already said, but I think sometimes we're dissatisfied and a bit fed up rather than truly disillusioned. I think there's a difference somewhere where, things aren't going that well and you're suffering a bit and you're kind of a bit up against it. And then when it gets a bit better, it's kind of easy just to let that be the end product almost. And I think, and I'm not knocking sort of feeling, it's good to feel better. I'm not suggesting that it's good to always be feeling like suffering or whatever, but there's something about losing the edge of why we're practicing that I think can happen. I'm not sure I can say much more than that, but I've felt it in myself at times, and I've seen it in others, where that real sort of edge of like, basically samsara is never, never, never going to give us what we're looking for ultimately. It's never going to give us ultimate peace, never going to give us ultimate, real, genuine, true happiness. And yeah, so something about finding ourselves getting a little bit complacent or something and losing the edge to the practice. I don't know if that, I don't know who asked that question. I did see it. I thought it was a really good question. I'm not sure who asked it, and I don't know if that actually says any more.
Well, I think it does. I think that I think that sometimes maybe in my own experience, you need to feel what disillusionment feels like, because disillusionment is when you no longer pick things up because you realize that you're dissatisfied with it, and you realize that it will never give you enough satisfaction. Whereas if you're just if you don't have enough I guess enough disillusionment with samsara, you're still thinking it's gonna meet you somewhere. And then that's just frustrating. And so getting that clarity. You mentioned at one point you had a quote from Subhuti around ardor being longing faith.
Yeah.
And I think that's a quality of Shraddha, isn't it? To really be clear about what's possible. And longing faith in particular is realizing that's possible for you.
Yeah. I think that's quite good, Ratnavian. When you were talking there, I was thinking about that expression of, is it moving the deck chairs on the deck of the Titanic?
Yeah.
You kind of make some shifts and some changes, and it feels a bit better. The view is a bit better, but actually, ultimately, it is not.
Yeah, you're still on the Titanic, aren't you?
Still on the Titanic, yeah. You're
Yeah,
still in
yeah.
samsara. Yeah.
Yeah. There was another question I thought was interesting. It was about anger, really.
Yeah, I saw that. Well, that was a good question.
Yeah, and there were yeah, they are really good questions. So I'm gonna try to move us through them but there were two questions that were very similar. One was saying that they see things like targeting civilians and kind of problems in the Middle East with the war. And kind of what do you do? How do I act against that? And then the other person was saying kind of like, well, when they see something like that, I think what they're saying is they get angry. And so how do they transform that anger into virya? So did you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think they're really, really good questions. I mean, I'm sorry, but it's a bit of a cliched answer, but I think metta, in a way, that whole thing, and in no way am I suggesting that this is an easy task, by the way. I think it was Anne that asked the question about anger.
Yep.
And whoever it was that asked Cara that asked the other question. I mean, they're the edge of your practice questions, and in a way I can't really answer them directly for people because I think we have to find our own ways of doing it. But I think one thing that can help is to be able to talk to people about how we're feeling about it without feeling that will be judged or that you're going to be a bad Buddhist because you went to go in a march for peace in the Middle East or something. But I think Cara, you've put it really well there. You said, how do you do all that without polarizing? Well, in a way, that is the thing, isn't it? Because I went some months back, quite early on in the whole thing happening in Gaza. I went to George Square here in Glasgow, where there was a big kind of march and a big protests and speeches and stuff. And it was, I mean, it was really quite interesting to be there. And people were, you know, saying lots of things that were really moving and interesting. And all I actually went to do was sit down on a bench and cry. And actually, that's what I did. And it was almost just like, you know, I felt like the only thing I could do was sit and meditate and just feel what I felt and not turn away from it. And not kind of I didn't want to get caught up in the kind of anger that was there. And I could understand it. It was very understandable anger. But I didn't want to get caught up in it. And I didn't really want to. I kind of felt for me a little bit like being back in the 1970s. There was something about the atmosphere that I felt, for me, it wasn't something that I wanted to ferment within myself. But you know, I was glad I'd gone. I was glad that I sat there and meditated, and I was glad that I had conversations with some people. And I felt that was like the best thing I could do. But I'm really, really sorry to people asking such extremely good questions that I don't think I can answer. And the thing about anger, I mean, anger is not necessarily unskillful in itself. I mean, hatred is unskillful. A kind of response of anger can be vipaka. You know, it can be a response to something that we observe or we see. But I think, again, Anne, you've said it yourself in your question, it's working skillfully with that anger. So I don't think you can block it. I don't think we can pretend we don't feel it. But somehow, if we can allow ourselves to work with that and put it into something, well, you know, use metta, maybe even like just doing something. You know, I think Mother Teresa once said, somebody said to her, oh, your work is just a drop in the ocean. And she said, yeah, but the ocean's made up of drops. And there's something about, is there anything at all we can do, whether it's donating maybe to somebody, some charity that we trust will actually use the money well in that situation? Can we, you know, can we protest but do it in a peaceful way? Etc., etc. Anyway, sorry, I'm not really answering your questions because the questions that I ask myself as well.
I don't know. I think you're selling your answers a little short, to be honest. I'm reminded of when Vajratara gave her talk. One of the things she said was that what we can be is the fourth sight for people. That you know, we can kind of offer them that alternative. And you know, I think that people underestimate that. You know, because it can really be. I remember when I mean, just to give you an example, there was a protest for it in during apartheid. And one of my friends was telling me that there was a protest down the streets in Auckland, and it was a big mob. Basically, this protest had turned into a riot. And he said that in the midst of all that, these Maori elders, these women, just came into that thing, and somehow their peaceful presence transformed an angry mob. And he recalls that, you know, it's interesting. It sends shivers down my spine, just like just recounting it. But he recalls that and how it just transformed the whole thing, like a jewel that's been dropped into muddy water can clarify the water. And I think that we I was thinking of your quote you gave about you know, from Star Wars, about the dark side being easy, faster, and more seductive. I think that we underestimate the power of the bodhicitta, which you finished that with a quote from the Bodhisattva, didn't you?
I'm looking at, is it Kerry? If that's wrongly pronounced, saying clarity and seeing conditions doesn't have to personalize. I think that's very well put. It's delusion and ignorance, whoever's acting. And in a way, that is the thing about not polarizing, isn't it? Because there's something about, if we can hold the bigger picture and just remember that everything is dependent upon conditions. you know, and in a way, that's where compassion needs to be true compassion. It needs to be with wisdom. It needs to have wisdom. And that wisdom fundamentally is the realization of the non-separateness of self and other. And in a way, realizing that everything that happens arises in dependence upon conditions. And we don't know all those conditions. And that's true on a kind of single individual personal level. It's also true on the geopolitical level. Like, you know, thinking about what's happening at the moment in Gaza, I don't personally feel I've got, I think you can unravel and unravel and unravel and unravel it. But in a way, it's so complex and the conditions are so meshed together that, you know, in a way, if we can kind of hold it in a big enough perspective that where we can somehow continue to feel meta. I mean, everybody's suffering in that situation. Even the people that seem to be not suffering, they are going to be suffering in that situation now or in the future. So, yeah, complex. But I think, yeah, whatever, Kerry, you've said there, I think that's very good. Yeah, that you don't have to personalize it. It's delusion and ignorance, of course it is. And sometimes it's hard to kind of stay with that and not kind of get into blame and taking sides. Very hard. But it's what the Dharma offers us, isn't it, at the end of the day? And that being a fourth sight is such a lovely thing to remember.
You think we can squeeze one more question in?
I don't know, you're the boss.
Okay, I'll try and squeeze one more question in because I think it's a good one too. Is how do you know a near enemy is a near enemy? So what somebody was asking about was the difference, you know, they're unsure if something's enthusiasm or inspiration. How do they test that?
Yeah. Yeah, I saw that one as well. I think that's a good question as well. I think time will tell, really, in a way. I think that's the thing. If you can sustain it. I can't find the question in front of me. Oh, yeah. If you're unsure if it's enthusiasm or inspiration, and can it be both at the same time? Well, I think that's interesting because I think inspiration can include enthusiasm. I think they can include each other. But I think inspiration with enthusiasm. But I think if you've got enthusiasm without inspiration, it won't last, basically. So I think it's a test of time. And I wonder if maybe your friends can help as well. You know, I think I certainly have friends. I mentioned Damadina in my talk, who has been a guiding light for me for over 40 years. And there's definitely been times where she's stopped me in my tracks and told me I'm intoxicated or whatever. So maybe friends can help if they know you well. But I think the main answer, Nika, is that time will tell. And it's good to have enthusiasm. I mean, honest to God, honestly, I do not want anybody to squash their enthusiasm. Don't curb your enthusiasm. Just make sure that you've got enough practice behind you that it remains as inspiration. And just keep your inspiration alive.
I guess that's the thing about a near enemy is that a near enemy also is near. So that energy can be refined and transformed and is not completely opposite to what you're trying to cultivate. Mm. All right. Well, thank you. I think we probably do need to wrap it up now. Yep. So thank you very much, Parami. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. If you'd like to re-listen to Parami's talk or one of the talks that's been given previously, visit the website on the Dhammachakra, on the Buddhist Center online. It'll be there somewhere. There might even be able to get a link in the chat for that. But you'll be able to catch up on things. And there was a lot in your talk, Parami, so I think it would pay me to go back and listen to it again. And just to say also that we've got 2 more talks coming up. So we've got a talk from Amala. Amala is an order member, well, college member from the States. So it'd be an opportunity for people to meet Amala and get to know her a little better. She'll be talking on samadhi. And what's the date on that? I got that here. That's going to be in the start of August. And then we've got Mahamati, who's the incoming chair of the college. And you were the International Order convener with Mahamati for quite a few years, weren't you?
I certainly was for 10 years. Well, about 8 together, I think, 7 or 8.
Yeah, yeah. So he's going to be talking on prana, which is the last of the paramitas. Yeah. So
And
yeah.
thank you, Ratnavura, for hosting and introducing me and holding the evening. And I think Akasajoti, I think you were one of the driving guides, forces behind this series of talks. You certainly were the one that got me to do this one. So thank you for all the work that you do generally. And again, a huge thank you. Muchísimas gracias. Akema Dara.
Yes, thank you very much. So do you want to, you got 30 seconds. Do you want to leave anybody with final words of encouragement or advice?
Yeah, just remember what Che Guevara said, that the true revolutionary is driven by love.
Excellent.
I'll leave it there.
Excellent. The true revolutionary is driven by love. Fabulous. Fabulous. All right. Well, thank you very much, Parami. Thanks everyone for joining us. And we'll wrap it up. I hope you continue to either have a good night or a good morning wherever you're at. And what's sayonara mean? Is that
What?
Spanish? Is sayonara Spanish?
I don't think
it's Japanese for goodbye.
Japanese for goodbye.
Okay, there you go. Sayonara.
Adios.
Adios.
Ciao.
Yep, feel free to
Thank you
unmute
all.
and say, yep.
Thank you so much.
Ciao.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you
So much.
Sadhu.
Sadhu.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.